Coming up next is the Perspectives in Sports Diplomacy, moderated by Dr. J. Simon Rofe, scholar, reader in Diplomatic Studies, SOAS, University in London. He is the inaugural program director for the MA Global Diplomacy and was the school's head of digital learning 2016 to 2020, where he devised the institution's first online learning strategy in 2018 and led in the strategic response to COVID-19 in preparations for online delivery for September 2020. I now hand over the floor to Dr. Simon to lead his session on perspectives in sports diplomacy.
Good morning indeed, and thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's my great pleasure to be here today to take part in the Josoor HIWAR event. I am joined by a number of colleagues over the course of the next hour, not least Josoor's own Vazken. So we'll get to that in a moment. I will attempt to share my screen, which always is a moment of terror for a presenter, but here we are. So good morning. Yes, we're going to be talking from here in a very sunny London around perspectives in sport diplomacy, particularly on the notion that it's more than a game. I'm going to be joined by four colleagues, Dr. Dikaia Chatziefstathiou, which I always manage to mispronounce, so Dikaia will enable me to rejoin that. Mr. Gavin Price, Sean Cottrell, and as I say, Vazken himself, no less. It's going to be a little scene-setting operation on what we consider sport diplomacy to be, and an opportunity for a dialogue. I have a couple more slides here, which I'd like to share with you as we get going. But please feel free to share in the question and answers any of the consequences that come up from what we're talking about. Be that from London 2012, an example of UK sport diplomacy, and perhaps infamous ping pong diplomacy of the 1970s between the United States and China, and from ancient sport diplomacy, this pillows from the Temple of Zeus in Olympia, in Dikaia's homeland in Greece. So this gives a sense of the breadth of sport diplomacy, and also what we're going to be talking about this morning. So I'd like to start with this image, if I may, and ask what's going on here. We can see in the picture President Xi of China, Sergio Aguero, Argentinian footballer, no little repute, and a gentleman who was formerly Prime Minister in the United Kingdom. And this was a picture taken by a selfie, no less, by Sergio Aguero, and posted on Twitter to his 9 million followers, many of whom are there because of his footballing exploits, I suspect. But nonetheless, there's a lot going on here. And really, what I want to stress in this is the variety of different stakeholders that are at play in sports diplomacy. So here you can see the two governments, president and a prime minister, the ministries of foreign affairs, which have come with them, as it were, to this picture, a football club in Manchester City, one owned by the Abu Dhabi City Group and Chinese state investment. You have the individual athlete, the agency of them taking the photograph, and of his club in Manchester City, his nationality in Argentina, the fact that he's also married to possibly the most famous Argentinian of the 20th century daughter in Diego Maradona. We also have some regional context. This picture was taken on the Manchester City training ground in Eastlands in Manchester, part of an urban regeneration effort within the Northern Powerhouse, a sort of moniker for a particular urban regeneration project. We have multinational corporations in Nike. We have the facilities management that is there. And we have the hospitality and all of the other tropes of different jurisdictions. So what we're talking about here is there's a lot going on in sport diplomacy. But to provide some perspective, some handholds, some rationale, if you like, it gets often talked about in terms of relations to cultural diplomacy, to public relations, to public diplomacy, soft power. These are terms that are often bandied around. And what sport diplomacy does is provide a firmer foundation for that discussion. And I offer here the definition that I wrote about in this book about sport diplomacy being an explanatory overlay, a network of evolving networks, which allows people, practitioners such as yourselves, within different worlds of sport and diplomacy to talk to and learn and reflect from each other and each other's practices. And that's important, not because of, as it were, a self-indulgent dimension, but because to be better at our jobs, whether that's as a diplomat or as an athlete, or any of the spectrum of opportunities that exist in between, we need to understand other perspectives and other perspectives in sport diplomacy. So that's really all I wanted to say by way of an introduction. And I'll open the floor to others. I'm going to turn to my colleague Gavin Price, if I might, first of all. So Gavin, over to you.
Thank you, Simon, and good morning to everybody. I'm just checking, can you all hear me? All
Can
good,
indeed,
fantastic. Fantastic. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to everybody today at the Josoor HIWAR Institute. Really appreciate it. So I'm just going to build on Simon's brief presentation. So I'm Gavin Price, an independent sports diplomacy and international cultural relations consultant affiliated to SOAS, University of London and Bond University in Australia. I've got a specialist interest in sports diplomacy as it relates to small nations and regions. I'm a native of Wales in the United Kingdom, a small country with a large sporting footprint. So just want to talk to you briefly about a research report that I co-authored on behalf of the British Council Wales. It was called Towards a Welsh Sports Diplomacy Strategy. As I mentioned earlier, it was commissioned by the British Council Wales and broadly supported by the Welsh Government. Based on a lengthy fieldwork process, it asked more than 130 stakeholders across Wales, the UK and internationally, what role has, does and should sport play in the diplomacy and international engagement activities of Wales. So I'm just going to go to the terror moment and try and share a few slides with you, so if you just bear with me.
I think as Gavin's just setting that up, worth contemplating what you consider sport diplomacy to be, and we'll be very pleased to address that when it comes to the Q&A.
Can you guys see the slides?
We can indeed, sir.
Fantastic. Okay, I'll just put it on presentation mode. Okay, so I guess one thing that I really wanted to point out is that the findings and the recommendations of this report were launched in November 2020. It was, as I mentioned earlier, it was based on field work with around 130 stakeholders from across Wales, the UK and internationally. So it had a truly global impact. Now this is obviously quite a big deal for a small nation like Wales, who's trying to work with the United Kingdom government to, I guess, market Wales within the UK system as the UK sort of manages the impact of moving out of the European Union and also in a post-COVID world. As I said earlier, the global impact was fantastic. I do know that there were some representatives from the Qatar 2022 World Cup Local Organising Committee, but as you can see, there were various governments around the world, so sovereign governments, regional and sub-state governments like Catalonia and the Basque Country. We had the Australian Broadcasting Corporation there, UNESCO, Chelsea Football Club, many stakeholders from other UK nations, from the public sector and from across Wales. So people like the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the Department for International Trade in the UK, and then at a Welsh level, Football Association of Wales, Welsh Rugby Union, BBC Wales television. Just a real diverse raft of stakeholders interested in Welsh sports diplomacy. We also had a great deal of European and Francophone impact. I was interviewed by the Josoor platform, which is a platform that's been developed by Emmy Lyon Business School and the French Institute of International Relations and Strategic Affairs. We also had an article featured in the EU's Peak Journal, Sport and Citizenship, in both French and English. But very quickly, I guess the main sort of area where we had the most global impact was that this research led to a freestanding sports diplomacy policy framework within the Welsh Government's Action Plan on International Relations through Public Diplomacy and Soft Power 2020 to 2025. There were a whole raft of recommendations within the report, and there are a whole raft of short, medium-term and long-term goals within the Welsh Government's policy paper, and you can see some of them on the screen. I'm not going to go through them individually because I want to give the floor to other speakers. But one thing I just wanted to wrap up with very quickly was that Welsh sports diplomacy is definitely working already. We've had a lot of success. So one of the key recommendations was we wanted to build on the number of Welsh people who were represented at national, regional and international sporting regimes such as UEFA, FIFA, World Rugby, at the International Olympic Commission and so on. The reason for this is that certainly at UEFA and FIFA, a small country like Wales rubs shoulders with major sovereign nations from around the world, whether that's the United States or Brazil or major European countries or countries in MENA. It is an equal partner, whereas it doesn't have exposure so much directly at other international fora like the United Nations or European Union, because at that level it's represented by the United Kingdom. So to have Welsh representatives at these fora is a really big deal. So at the moment, as part of this project, we're working with an individual called Professor Laura McAllister. She's aiming to be the UEFA women's candidate for election to FIFA Council, and she's up against an Italian counterpart. So hopefully we can get Laura promoted into the FIFA Council. I mean, Laura is an interesting person because she not only is she a professor of governance and politics at Cardiff University in Wales, she also played 25 times for Wales women. So she's truly representative of the modern game of football and would be representative of progressive Wales. Another good example is an area we've called diplomats in tracksuits. Some people love that term, some people roll their eyes at it. Basically what it means is we're trying to develop partnerships between Welsh athletes and the Welsh Government, the British Council of Wales, to represent Wales on the world stage as sports diplomats. So very recently, a 14-year-old table tennis player called Anna Hersey, who's from Wales, but she has Chinese heritage through her parents. We helped her become a United Nations champion for climate change in sport. She was very interestingly contacted by Joe Biden for advice on climate change and sustainability issues. So, you know, that's a really big deal for a small country to have a young up-and-coming athlete going into bat for important causes, being contacted by one of the world's major leaders. And lastly, it also triggered the Welsh Government to send its largest ever trade delegation to the Rugby World Cup in Japan in 2019. Rugby was used as a platform for engagement around trade and Welsh-Japanese cultural relations. So that's just, I guess, a really, really quick overview of a very complex project. But if I just had to sum up some of the benefits for Wales or small nations who may be interested in having a more strategic and joined-up sports diplomacy approach, basically it's given Wales or small nations a competitive advantage over other small nations not doing sports diplomacy in a systematic and joined-up way. It ensures that the local sportscape within Wales and internationally is more joined up. What I mean by that sportscape is anyone from diplomats, sports federations, to clubs, to individual athletes, universities, NGOs, all joined together, all working in tandem to help Wales go into bat for itself on the world stage through the platform of sport. And obviously, if you plan it correctly, then you can use sport events as staging posts. There's always something around the corner, whether it's a World Cup or a European Championships or Olympics or whatever sporting event. There's always something around the corner, and if you can think about this in a careful way, you can plan accordingly to deploy different sports diplomats for different needs at different events. So I might leave it at that, Simon, and hand over. I think, is it Dikaia who's up next?
Yeah, Gavin, thank you very, very much. Yes, we'll hand over to Dikaia now. Thank you for sharing those thoughts on Wales and the value of sport to what may appear to be a small nation, but with a big sporting presence, as you say.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Okay, well, is it Sabah El Kayur? To everybody. It is an honor and a pleasure to be with you today and share this panel with my esteemed colleagues. And I always learn something new. I have attended them in several other meetings and conferences, but I always feel I'm learning new things from them. So today I will be talking to you about the Olympic perspective, because obviously when we talk about sport, our mind goes straight away into the Olympics. And when we talk about sports diplomacy, there is a long history about sports diplomacy and the Olympics. Especially, I think you in Qatar are particularly interested into sport diplomacy and sport, because as per the announcement of the Qatar Olympic Committee in January, you are actually hosting 63 events in 2021 alone, and 6 of them are international. So there is such a big spectrum for capitalizing this dynamic that Qatar is having. In terms of the Olympic Games, as you know, I'm Greek, as Simon mentioned earlier. I will repeat my name just for the record. Yes, it's not easy, Simon. It's not easy. It's Chatziefstathiou, and I am from Greece, but I've been living in the UK for the last 20 years. But my attraction into the Olympics was actually partly because of my heritage. And if we go back into the ancient Olympic Games, we will see the term HIWAR, which actually means giving hands. So this is actually, let's give hands, let's have truce. And it was introduced in the past between these ancient games, and any war had to be stopped during the games, during the Olympic Games. If we move on a little bit into today's society, we can see that things developed since the ancient Olympic Games, and this was due to different revival. There were a few different revival attempts, and some of them were also from Greek people, but the most successful one has been the one from Pierre de Coubertin. And here what you can see is a quite important document. These are the 12 pages of Coubertin's manifesto in 1892. And in these 12 pages, which I have actually analyzed for my research, he had called for the world to come together into an event that through sport, they can have a dialogue, they can understand each other, they can educate each other about each other's values. So in this picture, we actually see Coubertin sitting on the left without the glasses, and then Vikelas is in the middle, who is the Greek, the first president of the International Olympic Committee. And what he actually said, Coubertin, was in this manifesto that it is clear that the telegraph, railways, the telephone, the passionate research in science, congresses and exhibitions have done more for peace than any treaty or diplomatic convention. And then he added, well, I hope that athletics will do even more. So he actually recognized the power into athletics. When he referred to athletics, he mentioned, he actually meant sport more broadly. So into this manifesto, when he tried to convince the elite classes in Europe and America mostly to join him into this venture, he emphasized the power of athletics to actually do more for peace than any other event, and he recognized this power in sport. And he also said that those who have seen 30,000 people running through the rain to attend a football match will not think that I'm exaggerating. So he recognized the appeal of sport into an average person, to a spectator, and that this appeal has a multi-layered power. And this is essentially what we talk about today. This sports diplomacy is this kind of a soft power that Simon also mentioned that that sport has. And Coubertin also said, let us export rowers, runners, and fencers. This is the free trade of the future. And the day that is introduced into the everyday existence of all Europe, the cause of peace will receive new and powerful support. So apparently here he talks about the free trade of athletes, the free trade of people. Although he mentioned the athletes, he also mentioned about spectators. He mentioned all this kind of transit of power through sport. And if we move a little bit later, we can actually see that, I don't know if any of you recognize the banner at the back. This 2011, and this was an event that was hosted in Qatar, together with Peace and Sport and the Table Tennis Federation. This is such an important event, because this was what followed up. So during the games, the Olympic Games, Coubertin launched them in 1896 through this manifesto that he wrote in 1892. And through the years, if we go back, if we had more time, we will see a lot of events that we can understand sports diplomacy. But during this kind of period, and away from the Olympic Games, but in relation to Olympic sport, we can see the ping pong diplomacy that had happened. And then as part of this, that we can also discuss later on, maybe in our question and answer session, this event in Qatar was the very first event that used the ping pong diplomacy to bring together teams, like we have the South Korean and North Korean athletes playing together in the same team. So this is an excellent example of how a peace and sport organization teamed up with a state like Qatar to host an event that was totally dedicated into sports diplomacy. However, what we need to understand is that sports diplomacy does not only happen into this kind of designated sports diplomacy events that peace and sport hosted. Sports diplomacy can happen at any level, and it's very important. You are practitioners, and maybe sometimes sports diplomacy can be very vague. When we think about sport diplomacy, soft power, politics can be vague, but they have a real value in practice, and this can vary from public sector, that governments can use sports diplomacy in the way that Wales was using, that we actually saw now. So it can be at a different level within a state. It can be at the private sector, at sports clubs. It can be there in terms of bringing together, even not necessarily international level, but at the local level, bridging different kind of populations together and making them feel more of a community. Or it can even be at the civil society level. And I have been involved in lots of different initiatives, like, for example, in Greece, I'm a member of the board of the Urban Dig project, which is a bottom-up kind of, it's an NGB, and it's a bottom-up initiative to bridge different people from different capital and different backgrounds, and we can use sport and the arts to do this. So this is at the local level, but bridging different, as I said, could be immigrants, for example. And also I'm advisor for the International Olympic Truth Center, and I am writing for them different educational resources that we disseminate into the youth of Greece, but also international, through storytelling. So just think that sports diplomacy is not just about Olympic Games. It's not just about specific sport events that are about sport diplomacy, but can happen at any level: private sector, public sector, and civil society. And I think it's very interesting to have this kind of discussion now, after we finish all our panel talks, just to see how can you as practitioners contribute to this. Thank you.
Dikaia, thank you so much as always. And again, my apologies for mispronouncing your name. I need to go on a linguistic course, clearly, or indeed just spend more time having cups of coffee with you. That will help me too.
Sometimes I do it as well. So imagine how difficult it is.
Well, thank you again. If I might ask you to stop sharing there, thank you. I'm now going to turn to my wonderful colleague, Sean. Are you there, Sean? There you are, looking very dapper. Sean, straight off the back of presenting to FIFA yesterday, so I hope we are a suitably august audience for your work. Over to you, Sean.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this event. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the CEO and co-founder of an organization called Law in Sport, which is the world's leading sports law platform. We have over 29,000 registered members from around the world. Our clients and customers are part of a community of the likes of FIFA, the Asian Football Confederation, many of the world's leading sports law firms, academic institutions that teach sports law and sports business from around the world. First of all, it'd be probably useful to explain what sports law is as a concept, and then also Simon, maybe we could end up in a dialogue really about how we met through Dikaia and sort of that evolution, which might be more relevant to the attendees. So in simple terms, sports law can be looked at in two ways. One, in which there's this concept that many of you may be familiar with called lex sportiva, which is a body of work or case law and rules and regulations around the governance of sport, which is its own distinct area, referring particularly to jurisprudence at organizations like the Court of Arbitration for Sport. Now, whilst there are esteemed colleagues in the sector who argue very convincingly that that is a very that is what sports law is, I would argue that a better way to look at what sports law is what is the work that lawyers do within the sports sector. So how is the law as applied to sport? So whilst you do have distinct and specific dispute resolution mechanisms, governance structures in place, and you could argue that you have the same in healthcare, that you have the same in pharmaceuticals, that you have the same in energy, that you have the same in these areas. The one thing that is certain is that as the sports sector across the world is becoming more professionalized, as governments, as we heard earlier, are recognizing the influence, the social power and the attention that sports drives, the demands for the sector to professionalize around the world has increased dramatically, and therefore having good legal structures, contracts that people can rely on and trust, such as the World Cup, having contracts in place to make sure that stadiums are built on time and that fans can access them, that people can buy tickets, that media can be broadcast around the world, that intellectual property rights are respected, has become all the more important. So to put this into context, I can share, yesterday I was asked to give a talk for FIFA, who do a fantastic event called the Football Law Review. And I was actually asked to speak on issues outside of football, which I thought was quite humorous given that everyone was there to talk about football. And I'll share some of the slides to put this into context. So when I was given this presentation, from a law in sports perspective, and just in terms of the breadth of which law influences the sports sector, we have 29,000 registered members around the world, which I alluded to. We also have 100 members of our advisory board and editorial board who are made up of in-house counsel, private practice lawyers, academics, and so forth. We produced 233 peer-reviewed articles last year by 100 authors from around the world. We've produced over 2,000 peer-reviewed articles to date, and we held 90 panel discussions. And if you are interested, you can see the links to the reference materials by going to that. But the main reason I was going to, and I'll fast forward through some of the presentation, it's been recorded if you're interested in it. just to touch on the broad areas in which sports law can touch on. We've got the commercial, so making money from sports, such as sponsorship, the relationship with betting, data, image rights, agents fees, tax, and you'll start to see from a diplomatic perspective why some of these become quite important, and particularly from a political standpoint. Issues around transparency, decision-making, separation of power, human rights, salary caps, diversity. Hot in the press, and many of you would have seen the high-profile Sheldon report that came out in football around historic, well, I say historic, but the abuse that took place in football, and there's issues around gymnastics around the world. So that's becoming, as we heard, it was a great example actually. Gianni Infantino has been pushing for an international body to deal with athlete welfare and abuse cases from a global perspective. WADA being a kind of the World Anti-Doping Agency being a prime example of where law meets politics and sports diplomacy. I think it was, and Simon, you can correct me, I think it was probably the most quickly any international charter was signed. I think it's got some sort of records there. And of course, then we've got issues around athlete rights, and then obviously the dispute resolution, competition law, transparency, public interest, and so forth. So that's a whistle-stop tour, because I know that you're not here to have a legal lecture. In terms of where sports diplomacy meets law, one of the criticisms that I never really appreciated up until recently. So initially, when we set Law in Sport up, the mission is to give people access to accurate and accessible legal information. For that, we thought, well, we should probably know the law. That would be a good starting point. And then we realized that economics, particularly looking at issues around financial regulation in sport, such as financial fair play, became all the more important, and funding. And then I had the pleasure of being invited by Dikaia and Simon to an event on sports diplomacy. And I turned up and I wasn't quite sure why I was there, to be honest with you. But then I got to hear about the UN guiding principles, the UN Sustainability Development Goals, and about how, from a diplomacy perspective and from a politics perspective and a policy perspective, how this influences how governments look at sport. And yet on the ground, from our perspective, from a lot of lawyers, both in-house in international sports federations, some of the top sports leagues around the world, and private practice lawyers who are serving the sports sector, we'd never really had a discussion around those issues. And I found it enlightening and opened up a new perspective in terms of some of the things that were discussed were issues and frustrations that many of my colleagues in the legal sector had voiced because they hadn't been part of that discussion. So with Simon, Dikaia, Professor Richard Parrish, the European Commission, there's been a sort of, and some of the work that we're doing, drawing attention to the importance of having lawyers involved earlier on in discussions of setting policy, looking at implementation and dialogue. And the thing that I always nick from, and I referenced you guys yesterday in the presentation, and Dikaia, I did get your name wrong, so sorry. And I know you've actually sat down for a coffee and spelled it out to me before, and I still got it wrong. But the key point that when we look at it from a sports law perspective is communication, representation, negotiation, and particularly that representation negotiation has been a key part of sports law, looking at the tension, particularly around collective bargaining in the United States and around the world between the labor, the players, essentially, in such as the NFL and the NBA, and the owners and the leagues. So that's been one area. But I would argue that the greatest sports lawyers and the ones who are being most effective are recognizing that communication is a key component, part of that. So that was my little brief intro. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you very much, Sean, indeed. I think the point to pick out there is the importance of those three key tenets of diplomacy is negotiation, representation, and communication. And when those three are in play, and they can happen, between diplomats and ambassadors and embassies, but they can also happen between, teams of sports men and women. They can happen between young children. They can happen in a workplace environment. They can happen in different realms of professions, such as legal or medical, but also in business, in transactions of commercial variety. So all of these come to play very distinctly in terms of how you can see sport diplomacy playing out, because it's that sort of meshing of the different realms that comes to play. So I'm now going to turn to my Josoor compadre, Vasco, just for a little insight and perhaps reflection on his experience of sports diplomacy, perhaps invested in having listened to me ramble on about it on occasion. But Vasco, over to you, and then we'll bring it back together for some questions. I see in the Q&A a good number, so thank you. Vasco.
Thank you, Dr. Simon. It's always a pleasure to see you, and thank you for also inviting me to be part. I was just listening to the conversations from the different guests on this session, and really just kind of brought me back to where we had also actually had sat down and really talked about so many projects and programs in mind. I'd like to just take a few steps back to just also share with our audience Josoor Institute's view in terms of sports diplomacy, how Josoor Institute specifically takes care of the element of sports diplomacy as it is its infancy stage, if I can say it so, in the GCC region, and it really has picked up in the past years, the interest to it, and yeah. Just to share a few facts about Josoor. Josoor was established in 2013 of December, and our main goal was to really upskill the human capital, eitherly who are going to be directly and indirectly related to the delivery of a superb World Cup. And in the journey of that, it was all about making sure that we provide the proper education, the proper training, the proper development to staff and non-staff, and it was a mandate from Josoor. So as the years passed and we focused on so many topics in terms of education, training, development, we had programs from a 1 year, a kind of diploma program in the sports management and events. And then, of course, really focusing on certain topics, which were already mentioned previously. Sports law was one of them, the general events management, the business of football, the sustainability of the sport, venue and stadium management. And as I am getting closer to the topics, sport diplomacy really sparked that interest in the past few years. Both from the Josoor Institute and of course the Supreme Committee. And in specifically, I mean, yes, there are many effective implementations of the sports diplomacy elements in Qatar, but we're really looking forward to even get to know more about its different forms, as it is quite a growing concept. I am very much, I was lucky enough to witness a kind of sport diplomacy which took place in the 2019, let's say, AFC Asian Qatar in Abu Dhabi, where all nations actually from GCC involved in football in an Asian Cup, and where Qatar actually won that game, and that game was in UAE, and this was in the most turmoil times where there was some uneasiness going in the region. So that's I think it's a great example that can really be showcased and looked upon. Just to flash forward again, I mean, our conversations between Josoor and yourself have always been fruitful in terms of also some awareness raising in the region itself. I can always also remember the UNESCO webinar with Generation Amazing we did a few months back, and that was more on the awareness of local stakeholders, how effective sport diplomacy elements can take place, and in so many ways. Another example, I was recently in 2018 in Russia, and there was a huge observation program. And these observation programs really put all colleagues, both from Russia and Qatar, the visitor, in a nice concept of working together. And I do consider that an element of sports diplomacy, where we actually had to tap into the network, ask how things really went in Russia, and even before in South America, where the previous World Cup also took place. So again, and at the moment when we are actually really on the brink of having the major event in less than 2 years' time, Now we are also involved with FIFA indefinitely, the Supreme Committee with its tournament staff, with the operation and stadium staff, and the way it goes, whenever an event happens which is run by FIFA, such as the Club World Cup, which happened a few years back and then this year, usually what the Supreme Committee does is we have the local staff and they have their counterparts with FIFA, so equal amount of job titles coming from the FIFA side, and that alone, that relation alone, where the bridge has been really created, is, I consider, another level of sports diplomacy. So really going back to all these kind of elements mentioned, and you were going to say something.
No, just I was echoing your point. I think it's testament to, I think, the dialogue that this engenders, that you and I, as it were, have met and worked together over the course of sports diplomacy, in the same way Sean and I have, and Dikaia and Gavin, but all of us are coming at this from different perspectives, different professional backgrounds, different educational backgrounds, different national backgrounds. So we are having this dialogue through sports diplomacy, and on the one hand, there is just a value to simply reflecting on that and acknowledging it, because it enables us to then have other conversations. And the very simple point that I was endeavouring to make right from the outset is there are many different people involved in this conversation, not just those who are wearing tracksuits, to use Gavin's phrase, or those who are diplomats, but a spectrum of people who operate and are associated with, whether through commercial revenue, rationale, or legal, or whatever it may be, they're part of the dialogue. And I wonder if this might be a good opportunity to draw back on Gavin and Dikaia and Sean's perspectives on some of the perhaps the implications of sports diplomacy, if you've seen them play out. We've had a few questions come through. It's great to see Mahfoud Amara here. Thank you, Mahfoud, and a couple of others from Nadim and others. I wonder if there's a question here for Gavin, particularly around small states soft power through sport. And one, whilst as a resident of Wales for a couple of years whilst doing my PhD, I'm always happy to fly a Welsh flag, as it were. But there are other instances around the world. Jamaica in the past 20 years, its prominence as a sports diplomacy practitioner, from the exploits of Usain Bolt and his teammates, both in men's and women's sprinting, a small nation, 2 million people, but a huge global presence because of their sporting excellence. And I wonder if there's a question that Mahfoud asked around, the Welsh relationship into the UK government, but also how we might see that play out in other parts of the world that Sean and Dikaia might be able to comment on. And particularly also about the soft power implications here. What does it mean for soft power to use sport? And indeed, what does sport change about soft power? Some opportunities there. Let me perhaps go back to Gavin, first of all. Gavin?
Thanks, Simon, and thanks everybody for the questions. And in particular, you referenced Mahfoud's questions, which are really interesting. So what I will say around the Welsh project, it certainly wasn't the intention of the British Council Wales or the Welsh government to use Welsh sports diplomacy to promote identity politics in the UK or for an independence agenda. The British Council Wales is an inherently unionist organisation. The Welsh government supports the union, so it's certainly not about identity politics. Having said that, some of those themes definitely came out in the research and field work around sporting sovereignty and international recognition of Wales. So as I mentioned earlier, Wales is independently represented through FIFA and UEFA through the Football Association of Wales. It's a key member of World Rugby. But obviously, when it comes to the Olympics and the IOC, it's part of the British Olympic team. So that there were discussions around, would it be better for Wales's profile if it stayed within the British Olympic team, or should it seek to develop to make an application to have its own knock under the International Olympic Committee? Issues around things like the England and Wales Cricket Board. Traditionally or historically, Welsh players have played for England in cricket. Should Wales have its own cricket team? Does being part of the British system dilute Welsh identity and its ability to promote itself on the world? Or is it better for Wales that the UK has this long-standing and one of the most well-developed diplomatic networks around the world? Is it better for Wales to tap into that network? Can it get more exposure through the British system? So all these issues naturally came out. There were mixed response across the whole spectrum. It was certainly a vibrant space. But this report was definitely about maximising and fusing the best of what the UK can offer from the sports diplomacy and soft power perspective, and what Wales can offer, using its own unique, I guess, soft power value proposition for the benefit of Wales, but also for the benefit of the UK. So it's certainly joined up. Matthew had also mentioned Scotland, really interesting at the moment. Scotland, in my humble opinion, doesn't really do sports diplomacy. It has done elements of that. It has a kind of, probably a bit rude to use the word reactive, but it's probably done it, for example, around the Commonwealth Games, where there's a lot of work in promoting Scotland. But does it have a systematic and joined up sports diplomacy strategy like Wales is implemented at the moment? The answer to that is no. Certainly Scotland is looking at that, and I'm talking to a few people up there, like Grant Jarvie, who's another person who's an expert in sports diplomacy you may have come across in the past. So Scotland is looking at Wales and saying, what are these plucky Welsh up to? Have they sort of stolen the march on us in a friendly way, and they're interested in what we're doing and they're talking to us about that? At least initial conversations. But I think I'll just for a few final comments around soft power. If you think about a country like Wales, for example, when it reached the semi-finals of Euro 2016, that's a hugely significant thing. It's a really big deal. I think Wales was the smallest nation to get that far in a major international football tournament. The exposure that Wales got from that was beyond anything that it's ever achieved, whether that's through politics or wider culture or through the UK system. Just one niche example, the Welsh indigenous native language. Nike and Adidas contacted the Welsh Government and Football Association of Wales and said, could we use Welsh to make advertisements for our products? For a language which is spoken by only around about 800, 900,000 people in Wales and a few thousand around the world, that's a really big deal. It promotes sort of unique Welsh variables through sport. Would that have happened without the European Championships? No. Would that have happened without, for example, a superstar player like Gareth Bale? Probably not. So what I'm trying to say is, arguably, sport is Wales's #1 soft power asset. There has been British Council research on that. We actually found that to be the case, certainly when compared to other small nations and regions like the Basque Country or Catalonia or Scotland. So, Wales is really looking carefully about how it can use its sport to further go into bat for itself on the world stage. I hope that goes some way to answering some complex questions. I could talk about it for hours.
Thanks very much, Gavin. And Dikaia, if I might come back to you for some further sort of reflections on perhaps the soft power of sport as you've seen it play out.
Yes, well, thank you, Simon. I was reading Nadim's question actually about this, and I will repeat the question. It is in the chat. Nadim asked that when we talk about sport diplomacy, is soft power a foreign policy used to show strength, and it's used by a country to position itself in the international community, or it's actually meant to bring people together? And I think that's a very good question, because I think that's at the heart of sport diplomacy. This is how it's been conceived from different people and in different kind of levels. I think that it is both. It can actually be both. I think what Simon mentioned earlier and Sean, that it is about negotiation, representation, and communication. This can be transferred at the different levels. And when we discuss about soft power, and I think Simon is more of a specialist in this than I am. But the way I understand soft power is that it can relate to foreign policy, but it's not just about foreign policy. It can be about culture, it can be about values, it can be about politics, it can be at all different levels. So it's not just about international politics. We are translating more into international politics because this is when there has been a different approach than through the hard power, because hard power was so much practiced at a state level that soft power came as a way to achieve things without question. But it's not just about foreign policies. And I think that it is more about bringing people together. But because of the power of sport as a tool for putting nations and states at the first line, really, in terms of power. That's why many states are so eager to host sporting events. These things come kind of close together. And if by hosting a mega event, a sporting event, there is still a genuine interest at bringing people together. We can see this evident at different levels. So we can see it at the state level, but also within the state. So the question is that it's a complex issue. Soft power can relate to foreign policies, but soft power is also about bringing people together. And the examples that Sean showed us before in terms of law, I really like your slide about integrity and governance. We can see that many of them had nothing to do with state as such in terms of the way that Mahfoud's question about the MENA countries and sport washing. It has nothing to do with that, but we can identify sports diplomacy there, even at athletes' welfare, integrity, safe sport.
Dikaia, would you? Is this a good and the other panelists, like, is this a good analogy that essentially it's a bit like social media, right? It's just a tool that can be deployed, so you can use it for great one-to-one interactions with people should you want,
Yes.
or if you want to do it at scale, you can do, and it depends on what your motivation is and what problem you're trying to solve.
I think so. That is the way I understand it. But that's why I said it can be understood at a foreign policy level, but can be understood at the example I gave earlier about the Urban Dig project, that we do things at a very, very local level, and we use soft power for issues of bringing together those different communities that they had nothing in common before. And through sport and arts, we actually made them to get to know each other and to understand each other. So it has to do with the level that you're using it. And I don't know, Simon, if you agree about this, about soft power, that it can be related in different levels?
Absolutely. I think it can work on a one-to-one basis. I mean, my work in diplomacy previously speaks to the transactions of diplomacy happening between individuals, the earliest possible polities, whether that was family, tribal groups in antiquity, from way back in the human existence, we have sought to communicate with each other, whether that's through art on cave paintings, whether that's through signage, whether that was through very early forms of language. And in that sense, sport transcends thousands of years to being currently a mode of transaction. You can have a conversation about sport without speaking the same language. You can share in the experience, the emotional connection with someone winning a gold medal, within someone scoring a goal, without necessarily having spoken to the 30,000 other people in the stadium, but you are there in that moment, God willing, in the future, to be able to share in those common experiences. And even when we can't do it in person, we can share, thanks to our little devices like this, in a common digital experience. And that's something that sport provides, that I argue in my work you don't get in other forms of cultural exchange. That's not to denigrate them in any way, but simply say that sport provides that communicative power in a way that other facets of social life don't. And it operates from two 12-year-olds texting each other about who scored the best goal at lunchtime in the playground, all the way through to Cristiano Ronaldo with his 20 million Twitter followers or whatever. all of those are communicative, nodes of activity, part of the network that enable you to have a dialogue and to recognize different parts of it. Some of them are, overlap, some of them are exclusive, but nonetheless, the dialogue that flows from that, I think, is a very powerful thing. And recognizing it in the first instance, and then being able to shape it. And again, this is where, going back to Joseph and I's understanding of soft power, about being able to shape and influence, not coerce, as you point out, Dikaia, shape and influence people's opinions and perspectives, because it's that perception that matters. And this, I think, picks up on another of the questions in the chat around, nation branding, and whether the extent to which, sport can be used in that endeavor. So the two things I'd say around that. One is, if you look at the work of Simon Arnholt, who is integral to the founding of place branding, and then it's really a sort of temporal quality. It doesn't transcend for generations. It takes an awfully long time to change a perception of something as substantive, and because of the system that we've created of a state, a nation, to change that perception. Now, that's not to say it's impossible or that it can't be achieved during a particular period of time. The research that was done during the 2018 Men's FIFA World Cup in Russia showed a distinct change in perceptions, largely within Western countries who held a different perception of Russia for that 6 to 8 week period. But those perceptions re-emerged or reverted, realigned, to use another word, to sort of previous perceptions of Russia. That's not only within the United Kingdom, but that was surveyed across other parts of the world also. And I think what that says is that sport has its moment, if you like the synergy of scoring the goal, winning the gold medal. As soon as you've done that, you hear of sportsmen talking about, well, I've got to get back into training, got to get to win the next gold medal, score the next goal. And there's something about sports diplomacy that we need to think of in temporal terms. That is, it works perhaps during the course of a sport mega event, perhaps during the course of a season, perhaps during the course of a career, an iconic individual who can capture some of those moments. But equally, it's not permanent.
And Simon,
have to be permanent. Sure.
So on that point, I'd argue, and this is where I think that there's some real, where our discussion has led to, where the opportunity in the moment. So as you talked about, which I thought was a great point around the temporal nature of it. Well, if you're trying to solve problems, and I would say argue that the opportunity for diplomacy within law and within sports law is really target fixated on solving problems, whether it is around abuse cases, whether it is around safety at mega events, whether it is around fixing issues around piracy, where there's common problems that those people who believe that sport should be, one, accessible, secondly, should have competitive balance, and all these other qualities which attract governments, it's great for health and education and all these other benefits. Fixating people on, rather than the performance and the competition side of sport, which obviously brings people together, but then distilling it and saying, actually, guys, what problem are we trying to solve here? And this is going to take a long-term focus and dialogue. You also then have the benefit of removing some of the emotion and tensions that are there. And that's what I've certainly found, of being able to bring together stakeholders who otherwise wouldn't talk together. I'm talking particularly from a commercial perspective. It's very difficult to get certain organizations in the same room, but when they're trying to solve a problem, they would happily go there. And the dialogue is one of respect and I would say collaboration, which provides that opportunity.
Thanks. I wonder if I might ask Dikaia for one more intervention. I know she needs to duck off shortly to attend to her students. Dikaia.
Well, I think I was reading again some of the questions, and Mahfoud has again. Hi, Mahfoud. Great to see you here. He has made a point about this sport washing in terms of the MENA countries, the MENA countries in the region, whether there is some kind of using sport for power, essentially, and then associating always the countries with this term. Well, I think there is always something disquieting when we talk about sport and power, there is some suspicion. How is it going to be used? Can it be used in the best way possible? What kind of interests do they exist in the background? And I think it's legitimate that there are all these kind of suspicion, let's say, of what are the real interests. But I think generalizing and putting everything into a single kind of a pot is totally wrong. And we need to understand what are the genuine attempts and the genuine interest in sport. And this is not about MENA countries. This is about the power of sport, full stop. We need to go beyond that there is an agenda that is attached to sport only for specific regions. Sport has a unique power that many countries, many states, they try to capitalize on it, even at a smaller scale to a big one. We saw like small nations, bigger nations, and this shows how powerful sport is. But then it's important to understand the layers of using sport. And that's why it's important. I think what is missing, and I want to throw this just before I go away, I think it's important to have some kind of vocational courses, professional courses for practitioners from different countries. I don't think there is something like that to understand in real practice how can this happen, because all the questions that I saw in the chat are extremely important, and we need to separate academic questions and dialogue, which is at a very different sphere, from the real questions. Okay, we have a sporting event coming up, there are nations with conflicting interests. How can we use sport diplomacy? Can it be used? Yes, it can, but how? So I think what is missing is this kind of a training for practitioners. I would be very happy to be involved in something like that in my university, to be part of it, to see how we can solve this kind of very practical questions, ranging from all the different levels that I saw in Sean's slide, which is exactly the point. So this is where
Thank you very much. I wish you well. Vasco itching to come in, so I will let him talk. But Dikaia, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Take care.
We will keep the dialogue going, Vasco. We'll talk again. Bye from me. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
If I may just add to and echo to Dikaia's recent points, this is exactly what we as Josoor are also looking, the skills that need to be, stepped up at different levels. Organizations, federations, other national, international organizations also, to really help them understand and build platforms of sports diplomacy and how we can tackle. So I really believe Josoor Institute has a big stake at this, and it would be highly advisable if all of the gentlemen and the lady from this session to start really focusing on so many levels of engagement happening either through training or development. So for the coming, I don't want to say years, months.
Absolutely. I think the opportunity is very much there, and the work that we've spoken about before, Vasco, lends itself to this opportunity and this platform to engage with the practitioners, and the questions that are coming through really speak to that. So in terms of some of the questions, particularly following up on that idea of sport washing, it's not new, and I think the attachment to the MENA region is unfortunate at best. You can look at the way the Soviet Union, a country which we don't need to worry too much about in the sense that it no longer exists, used sport washed the 1980 Olympics in Moscow, a classic case of sport washing. Unless we think that it was only one side, the United States in 1984 in the Los Angeles Summer Olympics, just as two very high profile events, shaped by the superpower tensions of the era, the Cold War, these things that
Simon, sorry, yeah. But do you think that time has now passed, as in the sense that for me, that a lot of this is about almost going back to very basic fundamentals of trusting your counterparts, right, and having honest dialogue? And in some aspects here, if you try to manipulate and abuse, a bit like Gavin was saying with the Welsh government, right, if there was a hint that there was undertones of manipulation that was there. It may work in the short term, but as you were saying, with this temporal period, the damage that could be done in the longer term can be quite significant. And so I would argue that in terms of, or at least like to think, and I'd be interested to get everyone's views on this, that, you know, using sports diplomacy in a more, let's say, authentic way would seem to be the way forward, and doing anything else would be risky at best.
I mean, I think that speaks to some of the changes and the validity of understanding the context in geopolitics of where we are. And I think that has shifted. We are no longer in the Cold War, as was, having spent some time studying that in the past. It's not necessarily the world we live in today. But I think it speaks to the question that HIWAR, forgive me if I've mispronounced that, points to about conflict and sport, and the opportunity that sport has to mitigate against some of those national conflicts between two countries. So you can look back at the example of the football war between El Salvador and Guatemala that essentially started over a World Cup qualifying match in 1968-69. So you have, some real life consequences to sporting events. Equally, you have sporting events which can provide impetus to national reconciliation. You can look at the 2018 Winter Olympics with the reconciliation. And again, this is a good example of the temporal nature of it, between North Korea and South Korea, brokered by the International Olympic Committee. So not another state, and in many senses, either the Russians, the Chinese, the US didn't help putting that, albeit turned out to be temporary opportunity together. But it was the function of the IOC that brought together in the Winter Olympics North and South Korean athletes and representatives for a period of time. And that's, what was there. But I think you can also look at it the other way. So at the time that the Russians and the Americans were boycotting each other's Olympics in 1980, 1984, the sport of athletics set up the World Athletic Championships in 1983, so that world-class athletes from both sides could compete against each other. So sport was able to take a step outside the geopolitical environment. And I might draw the parallel with the Asia Cup that Vazken mentioned earlier in Qatar's victory. The football was able to take a step outside, the difficulties that GCC nations were facing at that point. Now, that provides to me another opportunity that sport has to have dialogues that you wouldn't have otherwise, which again, demonstrates the validity of the point that Vazken was making, and Dikaia also. And in that sense, I think the question of success is perhaps less important, to speak to Ibrahim's point here. Sometimes actually it doesn't matter whether you win or lose. It's about the competition. It's about being part of the dialogue, about taking part. To use the sort of paraphrase of the Olympics. It's about being able to take part, not necessarily who wins the gold medal.
Isn't it also how you do it? Sorry. So isn't it also about how you do it? So one of the similarities in sport would be, if you look at the grit and determination of certain sporting teams, that can win over respect. And one of the processes, but I would argue again, likewise in the delivery, and with Qatar, the delivery of producing an outstanding World Cup would raise a profile, as would any nation. It was certainly the case with the London 2012 games. That you're looking to demonstrate all of the other expertise that you have in the business, in law, in other areas, and if you can perform well there, that creates an improvement in reputation. And I'll turn my mic off so Gavin can speak.
I'm just to say one thing about success, though. Success isn't always a direct correlation. Yes, you can look at your LeBron James, your Lionel Messi's as hugely successful athletes who have profile. But sometimes it's actually the valiant trier, the Eddie the Eagle Edwards. Look up the 1988 Winter Olympics in Calgary. He was the only individual athlete who was name checked at the end of the ceremony, at the closing ceremony. He didn't even, get to the final. He was an awful athlete in terms of his performance level, but the profile that he had was so high. And that makes a difference in terms of his ambassadorial, and dare I say, diplomatic qualities. Gavin, come to you, sir.
Thanks. I mean, just to build on I guess points from you both. I think, to some extent, a measure of a nation or region sports diplomacy sort of value is almost how it responds to difficult issues. No country has a perfect copybook. Just look at the UK at the moment. That we have the doping scandal in UK cycling at the moment. I mean, Wales, where currently our national manager is under investigation for alleged domestic violence. So how nations manage these difficult issues and respond with more positive sports diplomacy responses, I think, is sometimes a measure of their worth in that space. I think also, when we think about mega events, if you think about the World Cup in Russia, there was a lot of narrative before that around, the potential for the, poor treatment maybe of the LGBT community or the role of women in society. But by and large, to be fair to Russia, that tournament was successful. It projected Russia as a welcoming nation. Most people, everyone I spoke to that went to that event had a fantastic time. So I guess it's about focusing on what you're good at. For Wales at the moment, it's particularly strong in the social inclusion space. It's doing a lot of work around the inclusion of young girls and women in rugby and football, and helping them to develop as ambassadors for the nation and for sport. And I mentioned Laura McAllister earlier, and she's one of the key people behind that. So I guess, yes, the point is it's sport is fluid, it's fast moving, it's impossible for governments to control. But I think if you can get most things right and focus on the positive strands, then you'll go a long way to undermining the perceptions of a country, whether that's around, sport washing or whatever term you want to use. These are labels that you can actively address and change people's perception if you do it in the right way.
Thanks, Gavin. Vasco, I wonder if I might sort of draw some concluding remarks and think how what's next in this step from your point of view.
Well, I just want to yes, I just want to say that compared to other neighboring countries where tourism, other services sector were amongst the strengths they have, Qatar chose also, in addition, sport to be that kind of dream, and actually put it part of its vision of the 2030. So sports diplomacy is a major element, a major role playing also factor in what the country is looking forward. The mega event, the big game is coming in less than 2 years, I mentioned, and definitely next for us, for Josoor Institute, is really going deep with fellow colleagues, fellow subject matter experts, such as yourselves, to really go through, an enormous level of planning. How can we tackle the common denominator? I was kind of paying attention to the colleagues here is how. So that is something which really need to look at. And I mean, if you want to just compare it very simply to different qualities of diplomacy, I guess skills which are related to communication, skills related to the representation of something from a higher level, and even negotiation. These are things that need to be really looking upon, which constitute factors of diplomacy, but why not part of sport diplomacy as well?
Thank you, Vasco. A last word, Sean.
Well, I thought we had a question, but I'm not sure. We're not taking the. There's
please.
Is it I'm not sure how you pronounce the name. I think someone's got their hand up. I'm not sure if it's intentional or if it's been there the whole time. But I didn't know if you want to take that. If not, I just think what Vasco, yourself, Dikaia, and Gavin have been talking about, which is, for me, when I look at my journey in terms of looking at sports diplomacy and being completely naive to it, I would argue, was it 3 years ago now, 4 years ago?
Yeah.
And then starting to see, and me and Simon went for a lunch once, and he explained, this is a framework for which you to understand the relationships which are taking place. And from that point of having this framework, it's been incredibly useful to see the opportunities that are there. Not look at necessarily, as we talked about, some of the difficulties. Absolutely, they are there. They're plain to see, but they just exist in the world. But using this framework to see how you can make a positive impact, as my organization is focused on solving problems. We're obsessed with it, taking a first principles approach. What's the most effective way to solve a problem? And I think, not overcomplicating the issues and using the framework which Simon has articulated of communication, representation, and negotiation is such a powerful one that I think can be applied. It's certainly one we apply now with law and sport, and it's certainly one that we're witnessing being deployed. And I also think, there's so many lessons there, but in terms of, from Vasco's point, practical skill sets, I think there is a lot of work to be done there with equipping people with the right tool sets, not only from just the Josoor Institute, but domestically and around the world. I think is something, I think it's Simon Sinek referred to, who's famous and refers to these as human skills often. They're often overlooked in terms of, theoretical frameworks. And so I think if we can focus on those sorts of skill sets and practical focus, I think we'll be better placed. But just fantastic to be part of this discussion as always. And every time you do one of these talks, and I think we need to pick up another phone call after this to have a further discussion, because from a personal perspective, I've learned a lot. So thank you all very much. And thanks for your attention. Thanks for involving me.
Brilliant, Sean. Gavin, 30 seconds.
Sure. I just think, just in response, I guess, to Vasco, I think that a good starting point maybe for Qatar as a suggestion is, really looking at what are your assets, what have you got, who are your stakeholders across the whole sportscape. You'll know many of them, but some will surprise. There will be many people doing wonderful things that you could already call sports diplomacy that you may not be aware about. So I think bringing them together and joining them together, some kind of audit and review would be a really good starting point, and then taking them on the journey and talking to them about how they think sports diplomacy could work in the nation would be a good start. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for having me today. Really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure, Gavin, always. It's always good to hear
Simon.
from you. I would like to take the opportunity, and I'm mindful I'm keeping you a moment from your break, which is hugely important. But I would just like to say thank you to the Josoor Institute, HIWAR overall, to Vasco for all of his help and support throughout, to Afra and to Nicola McCulloch also, who's been really helpful in helping me work with Josoor. It's been a wonderful discussion. The quality of the questions in the Q&A, I'm sorry we didn't get the chance to answer all of them, but maybe we'll save some and come back in the future to do that. Please do feel free to reach out and be in touch directly. Questions we could ask about sports diplomacy in North Africa, Saif, and particularly in terms of conflict resolution are certainly things we can come back to. But the opportunity and the engagement is really, if nothing else from this session, we've been able to prompt a thought and a reflection on the value of the huge variety of different stakeholders. Then we will have done our job for a Tuesday morning. Thank you all very much from London. Take care, be safe. We'll see you soon.
Bye, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your conference. Bye.
Thanks
Thank
a
you,
lot.
Simon.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone. On behalf of the panel and on behalf of Simon, I'd like to thank also the audience as well. I'll be moving now from my guest hat and to the kind of presenter's hat. And we have reached almost half of the day of today's HIWAR Day 2. As Simon mentioned, a few of questions that were not addressed. We can always shoot these questions via email to info@josoorinstitute.qa, and we'll be happy to provide the answers.